Morning, everyone. My name is Jerry Sullivan, and I'm Vice Chairman of Edelman's International Public Affairs group here in Washington. I want to thank you all for joining us today. And as we kick off what will be the first of a Countdown COP series of dialogues, virtual panels that are going to be providing the perspective of international thought leaders from industry, academia, government, and of course the media as we head into the upcoming COP26 forum in Glasgow, Scotland, slated for November. We thought this was particularly important now to have this conversation because, as many of you know, after a 4-year hiatus, the U.S. is entering the discussion again. And this isn't to imply in any way that everything will rest on the shoulders of the U.S., but it certainly will raise the visibility of this issue and hopefully stimulate conversation and debate on how to address the increasingly important issue of climate change and the associated challenges that we all face. We know at Edelman from our discussions with clients that there's a lot of interest and some concern, frankly, about the upcoming meetings. We're going to be participating actively leading up to and during the summit, helping on media relations and event management, things of that nature. So as you all think about that, feel free to drop us a line if we can be of any assistance. But I'm not here for a commercial for Edelman. We're here for an interesting discussion. And to that end, we're very fortunate to have Charlotte Howard with us today, who's the New York Bureau Chief and Energy and Commodities Editor at The Economist. And as everyone knows, The Economist does not name the bylines of the reporters, but I think it's fair to say that if you read any interesting stories in The Economist on energy and the environment, you read something that Charlotte had a hand in. So just one quick housekeeping. I'm trying to make this a discussion. There is a chat function in the call here. So as you hear something of interest or if you have a particular question, please feel free to put those in and we will try to get to them directly or weave them into the conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Charlotte, please.
Hi, Jerry. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for asking me to do this. When you suggested it, I jumped on it because we have 3 great panelists from whom I think I personally will learn a lot, which will help with my reporting. But it's great to be here today, and I'm looking forward to a lively discussion on this. We have Paul Bledsoe, who's the former Clinton, who worked at the Clinton White House, as well as for the Senate, was Interior Department counselor on climate and energy. Will Walden, a senior advisor for Edelman, who served as chief counsel and communications director to Boris Johnson, Britain's prime minister, as well as Simone Borghese, who's the director of the Florence School of Regulation on Climate, a professor at the EUI and at the University of Siena in Italy. And so, you know, this is a very timely discussion. Of course, a week from tomorrow is the beginning of this Earth Day summit that Biden has planned. And there's a question of why does this matter, right? And it matters, I think, because this meeting is the first big marker of America trying to assume the role, arguably, of the leader, but certainly a key leader in the global effort to limit carbon emissions after what I think we can fairly describe as a hiatus during the Trump administration. And as the world's biggest emitter and biggest historic emitter and its richest country, it seems very unlikely that middle-income countries will go ahead and curb their emissions unless America makes a serious effort at home. And then America can also play a really important role in trying to galvanize action on the global level. That could be through climate finance, it can be through diplomacy, and we're beginning to see the results of that. This meeting is the first big test of what impact America can have. And more broadly, this is the first big meeting ahead of COP26 in November. As Jerry noted, rich countries really need to make clear commitments now in order to get the ball rolling to keep momentum up for other countries to make commitments ahead of Glasgow. So, you know, China is very unlikely, I think, to announce new firm targets under the Paris Agreement next Thursday. It may make some other announcements related to, you know, electric vehicle targets or sort of more targeted announcements. But you need rich countries, you need the developed countries to make big commitments now and then again at the G7 in June, in order for China to then move forward. Hopefully, we might see at the UN General Assembly in September, then you might see more commitments from India. So think of this as not the meeting, but a very, very important marker that then helps move momentum forward in the run-up to November. And so to get into this in more detail, I wanted to turn to the three panelists who provide perspectives from different parts of the world. This is obviously a global effort to limit climate change. And each of the big regions, we have someone who can provide an American perspective, a more broad European perspective, and a British perspective. Britain, of course, will be hosting COP in November. So I think we'll have a really fascinating conversation about this. Paul, I'd love to begin with you. As America begins to get back to the table, how do you see the country positioning itself? What are the key areas where you think actually it can make a huge difference?
Thanks, Charlotte. Well, Biden has been clear that climate change is one of the central priorities of his administration, both domestically and internationally. John Kerry is in Beijing today as we speak, meeting with the Chinese, trying to get them to make a bigger and more meaningful international commitment under the Paris Agreement. As you said, I don't expect them to do that immediately. I do expect them to make some kind of announcement, some token announcement ahead of the Biden summit next Thursday. Perhaps more importantly, Biden himself will announce new US targets ahead of the summit. The current US target of 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. In fact, the US is on pace to meet that, which is stunning given Trump's rollbacks. And it shows that US civil society, our business community, our consumers are far ahead really of the political battle. But I think Biden's ambition will be much higher. I expect a target by the United States of 45 to 50% below 2005 levels by 2030. I think that Biden will announce this in the coming days. And then domestically, Biden has, of course, proposed the largest infrastructure and clean energy spending package in US and indeed global history. Two quick thoughts about that. The first is that Democrats have tried to tax emissions twice, and it was a political disaster both times. They lost power both times in historic ways. They're not going to try that again. They've also been unsuccessful at regulating emissions. Every time they regulate emissions, for example, Obama's regulations were overturned by Trump. So their view is they need to put in place strong tax incentives and spending, a kinds of Keynesian approach to clean energy that will be broadly popular, and that the Republicans, if they and when they get back into power, will not overturn. And this is my final point, which is for all Biden's climate activism, which is incredible, and I think will dominate the next 4 years, the Republican Party has still not bought in to dynamic climate action, and it remains a serious concern. Those of us who've been working on it for a long time are trying to work with our Republican colleagues to get them to come along so that the United States can continue to be a global leader for years and decades to come.
Well, there's a lot to dive into there, so I look forward to asking you some further questions. But Simone, I want to turn to you because Europe is way ahead of the US on this. Europe has an emissions trading scheme. It has pushed forward big investments on a European-wide scale, but also within individual members of the EU. Can you talk about Europe's leadership on climate and how you see it evolving this year?
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you for having me here today. Well, the European leadership is obviously at risk, so to speak, because fortunately, Biden and the US are back on stage. But this is good news for us because we had a leadership that was deriving from the absence of the others in a way. So we are proud, I'm talking as a European now, but we are proud of what we have done in between. And I think it's a good sign that the others are following up. Obviously, Europe has put a lot of its credibility on the European targets, raising the bar up to 55% in terms of emission reductions, climate neutrality by 2050, and we see many other jurisdictions now following up. And as you mentioned, Charlotte, I think the most important pillar is probably the European emission trading system that was the prototype for the other carbon markets, and that now is, if I may say so, flourishing in a way, because we have the carbon price around 40 euros per ton of CO2, which was hardly imaginable a few years ago before the reform of 2018. Obviously, this doesn't mean that we have done everything. We need to do our homework to keep having this credibility and keep having this leadership in the climate negotiations. And I think that the Europe is trying to push forward even more. Maybe we can talk about it later, but we are trying, and I'm talking about EUI role, my role as a researcher, as the director at EUI, we are trying to put forward the cooperation among the main jurisdictions to a higher level.
Thank you. Will, in Britain, what is the host country for COP26? What's at stake here politically for Britain and for Prime Minister Johnson?
Well, thanks, Charlotte, and thanks for having me this afternoon. I mean, the short answer is a lot, a hell of a lot. This is the biggest event that the UK has ever hosted, and it doesn't just matter from a climate perspective, it frankly matters from a political perspective. And Johnson knows that the stakes are huge for him. It's a massive and unprecedented opportunity to kind of showcase UK PLC in a post-Brexit, post-pandemic environment. And the UK is also chairing the G7+3 in Cornwall this summer. So it means that he's got two platforms or pulpits from which to preach from. And the truth is, knowing him pretty well, he likes to preach. But it's not without risk. You have to remember that Johnson is effectively a prime minister at war. Since he came to power 21 months ago, he's been fighting a war with the EU that isn't over because the impacts of Brexit, aren't known and they're not great at the moment. And then he's had the pandemic. And that matters because he's seeking in the UK to level up the UK economy. He's seeking to make the north of England the same as the southeast of England and London. And he needs to be a Britain, he needs a Britain that is a leader internationally to do that. That means research and development, green technology, the stuff that's at the heart of what he calls global Britain. But the problem is he's barely left Britain since July 2019, and his two outward-facing foreign policy decisions, a hard Brexit and cutting foreign aid from 0.7% of GDP to 0.5%, these appeal to his base, but they don't exactly speak global Britain. And that's why he needs a big win from Glasgow. COP provides a platform for UK foreign policy post the EU. Climate is a global issue, so any progress in Glasgow will be beneficial to the UK's and by extension to Johnson's standing and ambition. But equally, failure to build on Paris to reach agreement, and the finger of blame will be firmly pointed at him personally. And that's something that he hates and he will want to avoid. Two other quick points. It's taking place in Scotland. That's interesting because there's evidence that a lot of Scots want to leave the United Kingdom. And what Johnson wants to do is use COP as a platform to say, look what we can achieve as one United Kingdom. Scotland couldn't have achieved this alone. So that's an important domestic consideration. And the other thing I think to remember is don't underestimate him. I think some of people joining today will think, he's a pretty strange guy. He's kind of out there. He's quite populist. He's actually an exceptional campaigner, and he will treat this event as a campaign and the next 6 months as a run-in to that campaign. And for all the bombast and the populist rhetoric that you get from him, he's actually very good at getting people to coalesce and reach consensus. And the Boris bonhomie is part of that. So he will want those people in the room to drive the best possible deal.
So that's really interesting. It's funny because climate change is, of course, the ultimate global issue, but all politics is local. I think that adage holds here, right? in informing the way that different world leaders strategize ahead of COP26. I wanted to ask about rich countries and climate finance. So there is, of course, the question of what countries do domestically in terms of cutting their own emissions, but particularly given that rising energy demand is going to come from middle income countries going forward, those are really the areas where emissions need to be targeted. There's a lot of interest in what the developed world can do to accelerate progress well beyond its borders. Do you see, that we can start with Paul and then turn to the others as well, that there will be a big increase in aid? That's a big question ahead of next Thursday's meeting, that you will see a big increase in aid?
Well, I think there will be a focus on aid for developing countries, in part because they're broke from the pandemic. I mean, it's just devastating what the pandemic has done to the financial standing of countries around the world. I think that Biden may focus on some very particular global resources, which, if undermined, will make it impossible to deal with climate change. For example, stability of Arctic sea ice. If we lose that ice, bets are off on the level of warming. The Amazon and other forests. One idea that's come to the fore in recent weeks here is the idea of climate action for debt swap with developed countries. I think that has some real opportunity to be done on a global basis through the international monetary system and banks. And I think it's something that the Biden administration is interested. More broadly, he is completely convinced that the US has to continue to have a major role in the world and will be plussing up foreign aid from the Trump levels. But I think more important will be a focus on these specific resources like the Arctic, like the ocean currents, like the Amazon, which, if undermined, are going to prevent climate protection.
And is that a decision based also on political reality, that he needs congressional authorization both to make good on the climate finance pledges that that Obama promised but then never came through, and then he also would need additional congressional authorization for anything above that? The skinny budget, as I read it, didn't include actually much on climate aid. That's
exactly right, Charlotte. He has to have a narrative for why it's in the US interest to help developing countries on climate change, to lessen things like climate impacts, which are hugely expensive for American taxpayers and really disruptive to our economy. So this is part of a broader narrative he needs to create about why the US has to help other nations around the world and key resources I discussed to prevent runaway climate change.
Simone or Will, do you want to jump in on the appetite for rich countries in Britain or in Europe more broadly to really increase climate finance?
Yeah, I actually agree very much with what Paul was saying. I think there is a lesson to be learned by COVID, is that we are obviously more intertwined than even we expected. We already knew we were in a global economy, global world, whatever, but it's even more than that in a way. So no one is an island, which applies to Great Britain, will as well, although physically you are, but we are obviously so much intertwined that we have to take this cooperation aspect into account. And aid is obviously one key point. Talking about this, I think that a topic that is coming up and we will have to face is debt restructuring for poor countries that otherwise are really bankrupting and won't have the money not only for the health expenditures that are needed, but also for the climate policies. And debt restructuring would help increasing liquidity and also avoid investment from fleeing away, because now obviously investment has decreased drastically in those countries. And another point, which is not aid, to be honest, but is a money transfer. It concerns Article 6 of the Paris Agreement and the so-called ITMO, the International Transfer Mitigation Outcomes. These countries have great potentialities to cut emissions, and so they could supply ITMO to developed countries. This is not about aid. This is paying for a service, if you want, but this could create the transfer of money that could help these countries move towards a green recovery.
So Charlotte, just 2 quick points from me on aid. It's interesting when you put that point to officials and ministers here, particularly in the wake of a cut to foreign aid of 0.2%, they immediately jump on that and they say, no, hang on. Actually, when it comes to climate, we've ring-fenced that part of the 0.5% that was 0.7%. That isn't changing over the next few years. They're still making that commitment. And that's obviously crucially important for Johnson, because it's very difficult to go cap in hand and say, aid is the key determinant and financial support for developing countries on climate change is a key determinant when he himself is cutting that. So what he's saying is, and what his officials are saying is, we haven't done that. And it's in black and white. If you look at the 4 aims that COP's organisers and the British government want from Glasgow, mitigation and protocols is one, but in the middle of that is adaptation. In other words, building on the Paris Accord around supporting developing countries adversely affected by climate change, by flooding, climate events, bushfires and the like, and finance. And that whole mix of public and private finance initiatives is the one thing when you talk to ministers here that they kind of really, really stress. It's twofold. It's about making sure that the $100 billion commitment that was made in Paris is actually enacted upon, and they get that money, but also the private finance initiative, which is, they have huge ambitions for trillions in investment for the new technologies of tomorrow. So, adaptation from an aid point of view and finance are 2 of the key things that the organisers are driving for Glasgow.
So each of you has touched a bit on the way that domestic politics play in this, and clearly in the U.S., as I'm sure our listeners or the viewers have noticed, jobs is a key part of the Biden infrastructure plan. It's called the Jobs Plan. So they're very much making jobs and climate action inextricable. And I think that Paul's right, that this does point to a new kind of interest in Keynesian economics, that you have climate policy that also includes an expanded role for industrial policy, pretty straightforwardly. In Britain, you've seen, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Will, but I think in Britain as well, they're thinking very aggressively about the way that industrial policy might align with climate goals. This is part of Europe's hydrogen strategy. Do you think that this is that the action on climate change is ushering in kind of a new way of thinking about government's involvement in the economy more broadly? Paul, let's start with you. And do you think that it will be effective? Do you think that this focus on American manufacturing, on American jobs, that it will be effective in advancing climate goals?
I do think it's a sea change. It's worth noting that the US, when I was in the White House in the 90s, in the Clinton administration, we pressured Europe to set up a carbon trading system. We wanted to have our own taxes, but we couldn't pull it off. So in that period, we were leading with a idea of taxing emissions as the key to mitigation. Lately, there's been a new adage that's come around, which is that computers weren't created because we taxed typewriters. And the notion is that investments in the basics of research, development, corporate tax credits for expanding clean energy are a better way politically, but maybe also economically, to grow clean energy and displace fossil fuels. I personally think that the jury is out on the effectiveness. We haven't even tried for real. I mean, we've had tax credits in the United States. They've been episodic. And yet, nonetheless, the US economy has reduced emissions 15 years in a row, pretty profoundly. There was a little bit of a bump under Trump, but in general, our economy is decarbonizing. I think the Biden effort will increase the pace of US decarbonization. Whether it will be fast enough to meet his pledges is really unknowable. The last thing I will say is as I mentioned at the beginning, there are broad elements of his proposal, especially things like tax credits for clean energy, that are likely to last. One area where the Republicans have not come on board is electric vehicles. And this is going to be a huge Donnybrook if the Republicans ever get power again. It's a huge contest between the oil companies and America's electric utilities. And the Democrats and the Republicans over the vision of transport in the United States. I would look at that as probably the Rorschach test of how America can truly move to clean energy.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Simone, how do you see this playing out in Europe? I mean, there's a risk that countries in trying to sell the idea to voters that a green transition creates lots of jobs, that you actually have a new wave of protectionism. Is that something that you observe, or is it not? And sorry, before you answer, I want to reiterate Kate's point, which is that we're going to move to Q&A broadly from the audience in a few minutes. So get your questions ready and you can enter them on the Q&A panel at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'm sure you're all fluent in Zoom at this point, so you don't need those instructions, but right at the bottom, you can click on Q&A and type in the questions and we'll get to them in a few minutes.
Charlotte, yes, thank you for your question. I want to try to answer based on some results. There is, in my view, a very interesting study by Cameron, Hepburn, Stern, Stiglitz, and other famous economists that was published last year on the Oxford Economic Review, if I remember correctly. And they show, based on interviews to something like 200 and more experts from G20, that the fiscal stimulus can be more effective if climate focused, so to speak. So in other words, we are talking about Keynes. So the Keynesian multiplier is higher, according to their study, if we go for a green investments rather than for fossil fuels. This is, the academic part of myself speaking. Now, if you go to the real world and then you ask me whether people might perceive it as just protectionism, so government intervention is just protectionist, I think there is a risk. I think we have to convey the message clearly and correctly that this is an intervention that can be economically sound, that can create job opportunities. But it's very important that this message is conveyed correctly. I'm thinking, for instance, about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Okay, so a measure that is very much heavily debated right now.
Maybe Simone, just to cut you off, because some people may not know exactly how that works. Could you define it for us and then?
It is basically imposing taxation on the import of goods that are emission intensive, so to speak. So it's a way to incentivize other countries to improve their environmental performance. But obviously, if not conveyed correctly, it may be perceived just as a protectionist measure that protects the European industries. That's not the case. It wants to create a level playing field. It wants to create maybe a climate club. So raising the ambitions of a bunch of countries that can set the pace for all the others. But we have to be careful in doing it gradually, in engaging the international partners, and also in allowing for exemptions if the others are doing their homeworks as much as we do.
Right. I think one of the things that is interesting is that you have to look at countries' domestic energy mix to understand their interests in this transition, right? So in Europe, there's more interest in a carbon adjustment tax because carbon border adjustment because in part because you already have the emissions trading scheme in place, right? And in America, you have a huge fossil fuel industry, as well as a growing renewable energy industry. In China, they're trying to limit, they're interested in moving quickly to electrification to become less dependent on foreign oil. So all of these different considerations play into how quickly different countries do and don't want to move towards this new future. So I'll ask one last question as moderator's prerogative before turning over to the audience. And that's about the private sector. You saw just in recent days, companies really urging the Biden administration to make that commitment, that hard commitment for 2030 to lower emissions by 50%. Companies were very outspoken when President Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement, voicing their concern that America would be behind. What do you see as companies' role going forward now that you have an administration that is more interested in serious climate action? Are companies going to continue to serve as activists in pushing the climate debate forward? How do you see them participating more broadly in this effort? Again, maybe Paul, we'll start with you, and then.
Sure, I'll try to be brief. It's a really good question, Charlotte, because I do think there has been a huge change in the C-suites across the United States, certainly toward a belief that climate action needs to happen for economic and security reasons. The most interesting aspect to me is how the Biden administration and corporate America will work together on regulation. We haven't talked about regulation, but the Biden administration is going to regulate emissions as well. They are going to regulate the emissions from American automobiles, from US power plants, from oil and gas development, methane, agriculture. There's going to be, they have not led with this because they want to focus on the carrot first and the spending and tax incentives that business is behind. My personal belief is that the regulatory system in the United States has been a disaster for the last 30 years because it hasn't been consistent and it hasn't provided industry what they want, which is certainty. I am hopeful that CEOs and Biden will work more closely together to create regulations that corporate America isn't spending all its time in court trying to avoid, but instead is actually trying to comply with. And that, I think, more collaborative effort by Biden to reach out to industry to create regulations they can meet could be truly transformative in the United States. I'm very hopeful about that. I think that's a big lesson from Obama.
What about the private sector in the UK, Will? Do you see big companies there playing a different role?
Yeah, I mean, Johnson has Johnson's all in on this. You could argue he's a late convert to this, but he's all in on what he calls he's developed a 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. And I think that's partly pragmatic, it's partly opportunistic, it's partly just reality. He knows that this is the international direction of travel. We're not going back from this. And as I said before, he needs to level up the country. He needs a mechanism to do that. And that green industrial revolution is part of that. But what's interesting when you talk to these officials behind the scenes who are organizing COP in Glasgow, they say that the private sector, has three roles to play in this, they think. And actually, the first big one is the Race to Zero initiative, which, although a UN-led initiative, is actually very closely aligned to what's going on in Glasgow. The second is investment in renewables and new technology. And the third, which is interesting and particularly prevalent here in the UK, is help to reach SMEs, on a carbon journey. So Race to Zero, fundamentally, it's a science-based net zero target approach rather than just vague promises. And when you talk to government, that is a really big thing that they're trying to champion. So there's a guy here called Andrew Griffiths, who used to be Johnson's chief business advisor. He's now his net zero champion. And he has literally spent the pandemic persuading FTSE 100 bosses in the UK to sign up to Race to Zero. He's had some success. I think they started with 11 signatures. They're now up to sort of 35, 36 signatures, but they've still got a long way to go. And then the SME point, I think, is quite interesting. if you're going to get noticed at COP, one of the things that they're really keen to do is to get more SMEs involved in the process of reducing emissions, and SMEs generally don't know how to do that. So what they're trying to do is they're looking to leverage big companies with significant SME supply chains, and because they can reach one company, they can reach 1,000 in their supply chain. And I think anything that big business can do to help small business on their journey to net zero will really get attention. It'll provide reach and support. And I think that the organizers of COP will be fundamentally behind that approach.
Okay, I'm going to turn to some of the questions from the audience. So we have, pardon me, just taking me a scroll through. So there's one question which is about, isn't there a risk? There are lots of companies who are interested in buying tax credits. Is there a risk between, I think by that you mean carbon offsets, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mario. Is there a risk between just buying carbon offsets and companies actually doing the real work needed to develop cleaner processes? So can you get out of this just by buying carbon offsets?
I'll just jump in real quickly. I've been doing some work with United Airlines, and they have just made a series of commitments where they're not going to use offsets anymore. They're not going to buy, forests in some distant land and assume that those emissions are going to be reduced. And I think there's deep skepticism among U.S. companies about most offset schemes. So they're trying to reduce their emissions much more directly. And this has become a measure of whether companies are serious or not, because some are still relying largely on offsets.
There's a question on partisanship in the United States, which is that a viewer correctly points out that the Energy Act of 2020, which was part of the omnibus bill at the end of last year, did include money for clean energy innovation, was led by Republicans, and that there's reporting that House Republicans may be rolling out a climate package. And the question is, do you think climate change, making it a political issue, slows down bipartisan progress? I have my own answer for that, but I'll turn to you, Paul, first before
I'll just be quick about it. There are some Republicans who are engaging. That effort in December was actually led by just a few senators, and it was focused on actually reducing HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons. And the reason it was done was because the U.S. stood to lose 35,000 jobs if we don't reduce HFCs in keeping with the Kigali Agreement, so that we can have access to global air conditioning and refrigeration markets. So this was very much driven by corporate interests. That's a lesson to us. We need to pay attention to what interest groups Republicans are concerned about and use that. Your questioner is right. We need to get Republicans on board, and we need to find ways to do it better. I don't think we're going to have much luck in this first 2 years under Biden, but it's something that eventually America has got to get a handle on.
And just to weigh in myself on that, I'm sure that people on this call are aware of a memo that was sent out almost 20 years ago now by a lobbyist that was advising the George W. Bush administration in the wake of Kyoto Protocol on how to communicate about climate change. And it included advice around questioning the evidence around climate change, whether it was actually real, and then pointing out that if climate change is a real problem, then something that will be solved through energy innovation. And it's remarkable how those 2 points have really stuck largely in political discourse for now almost 2 decades. And when you see Republicans interested in supporting most climate policy, it generally has to do with innovation. So there's some, as Paul said, in certain segmented areas, but you see Republicans supporting, for instance, investment in research in carbon capture and sequestration, which is important, but it's also something that sustains the fossil fuel industry, and so then it naturally plays to certain key constituencies. The reason why America is really an outlier globally in terms of looking at this only in terms of carrots and not sticks is because of continued intransigence by the Republican Party. And the idea of a carbon price is a is a very traditional tool favored by retired Republican economists, but not existing ones. So it's not like imposing a carbon price would be some kind of lefty idea. And so I think that Republicans are making real progress in recognizing that they do need to be part of the climate discussion. But I think that it would be a mistake to give them too much credit for acknowledging that the science on climate and pushing for some limited investments in energy innovation only. So that's my stance on it. Simone, you want to
I wanted to jump in on the innovation aspect and the carbon pricing, because what we have seen in Europe is that carbon pricing has a key importance, but it induces a limited amount of innovation so far. I mean, what we would need is radical innovation, whereas we observe mainly marginal innovation. And it makes a huge lot of difference, especially talking about climate, but also about economic growth, because we need radical changes to keep growing, and we need radical innovation changes to solve the climate issue. So this is to say that carbon pricing, I mean, I'm a big supporter of carbon pricing, so not retired yet, but on top of that, I believe we need also regulation to keep things moving.
Right. So I think that there are very few people who would say you need only investment in research or only a carbon price in order to have effective climate policy. It's a combination of carrots and sticks, because we're talking about transforming the world's energy system at a faster pace than has ever been attempted in history, right? So it's not a small.
No, that's true, Charlotte, but still I have perceived in the academic debate that there is this big risk of overlapping policies, so that some people believe, you have to go either for the one or the other, because otherwise they conflict. Whereas this overlapping issue is not as big as is somehow depicted, and that's why I was stressing this aspect. I think we need both.
Yeah, it's a fascinating. I mean, none of us really know, right, how to do this, because we haven't done it yet.
It's totally new to everybody. Yes.
Exactly. So it's a massive global experiment playing out under real-time pressure, which is what makes it so important and interesting to follow. So there was, let me scroll down to another question here. There was a note from someone who produces TV drama and movies for the international market, noting that there's not that much interest in commissioning stories about global warming, and kind of wondering about why that might be, if I understand the question correctly. And that people, basically the communications, I think, around global warming and climate change is a huge part of this. And what else needs to be done in order to bring the broader public on board?
I'll just jump in very quickly. I went to a retreat in Italy, actually in Lake Como, with Hollywood producers, directors, and others. And their general view was that the anxiety over climate risk is transferred to other more interesting threats, zombies, for example. I mean, in other words, that it's actually being expressed in popular culture, just in proxy mechanisms, because climate change is so difficult to show visually. And so that was the consensus.
But I guess zombies too, in the end.
I saw something about how people are being advised not to watch Contagion until the pandemic is well over. So I guess maybe once we have the global warming problem in hand, people will maybe then start making movies about it.
I would just jump in. I do think there is a lesson here. I think that Keynesian spending on the pandemic has opened people's eyes to how effective using science and government action with significant resources behind it can be in addressing an emergency. I think it has made people believe that government can be efficacious again, And I think in the US anyway, that has had huge implications for popular support for new levels of government spending that Biden is proposing. So I think there's a profound relationship between success at dealing with the pandemic and climate change.
Just to say, Charlotte, I would agree with that. From a UK perspective, although they'd never say that clearly, you know, the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic has been an opportunity on climate change, you can hear it ratcheting in their brains when you talk to them. If this had happened a year ago in the middle of the pandemic, when I think they weren't ready for this conference, I think the outcomes could have been different. I think what Paul talks about in terms of that global cooperation is really important for the climate change debate. And what they're banking on from a Glasgow perspective, the organisers, the British government, is that they can harness some of that they can take some of those learnings and say, you know, when you ask people in the UK, they very determinedly say their immediate short-term worry is the end of the pandemic. You know, but they're much more focused now on climate change because of it. And I think that the organisers feel that is something that they can really latch on to in the next few months.
So there's a question on ESG factors. So companies, of course, are very interested, and investors are very interested in ESG and making sure that their strategies are aligned with different ESG factors. How does that fit in with broader climate action advocacy? There's a question about whether the advocacy on climate is in fact at odds with, rather than in collaboration with, some of these broader ESG initiatives. How do you three see that playing out? Anyone brave enough to jump in?
I suspect Simone and Will know more than I, which is true in most cases, but I would just say that in the US, again, corporations have internalized ESG goals, and that they are, in their views, so the CEOs I have worked with view them as complementary, not competing.
I would agree with Paul, to be honest. I don't know whether this is a US and European perspective that we are bringing, and maybe at the global level that's not true. But yes, we did not internalize the externalities yet, but we are internalizing the need to internalize the externalities. You see what I mean? So in a way, I think it's getting part of the culture of our countries. And so I don't really see a competition between ESG and climate action, but maybe again that's a little bit a developed countries approach. I don't know, I might be wrong.
Yeah, sorry, Charlotte, go on.
No, please go ahead.
No, very little to add. I wouldn't profess to be an ESG expert, but I agree with Paul and Simone. It's definitely a complementary approach on that journey, but it is without doubt something that, again, you didn't feel was being talked about 18 months ago, but definitely is now, and sits alongside the climate journey.
There's a question from someone in the audience about whether climate is still perceived to be an issue that only a select portion of the population cares about. So only white voters or middle or upper and middle class voters. Do you think that's correct? And if so, is it the job of politicians to help make this an issue of broader concern? Is it the job of companies? How do you, this touches a bit on some of the themes we've covered, but how do you broaden that movement?
It's a really good question. I think it was entirely true for decades, that it was viewed as an elitist issue of people who didn't have concern about living paycheck to paycheck, which is half of America. And Biden's genius, I think, is tying the economic future of the country and clean energy together. I think that's why he may be more politically successful than his predecessors. I also think US public opinion has changed because of climate change impacts and their impingement on the daily lives of average Americans. When you see 52 inches of rain in Houston in 3 days and routine flooding in the southeastern United States, when you see 8-month fire seasons throughout the western United States, when you see impact on growing seasons in the Midwest, climate change is beginning to impinge on people's daily lives. And that's when the rubber meets the road politically.
Is this a partisan issue in the same way in Europe or the UK? To our earlier question about the degree to which climate change is and isn't partisan. In Europe, is this something that is divisive, Simone?
Well, I don't think so, but maybe that was true some years ago. So in a way, it's a similar answer to the one that Paul just gave. When I taught the concept of sustainable development in my courses at the beginning, talking about intergenerational equity, I was very much talking about the future generations, like in the Brundtland report, the famous sentence. But in these years, I don't need to refer to future generations any longer, because the future generations are the present generation now. The problems are now, and the young generation which is our future, is fighting hard for climate. No matter the color of your skin, no matter your family wealth level, it's really something interclass, interraces in my view. And the movement Fridays for Future has stressed this aspect very much. So again, I think that was more in the past, much less now, and I expect it will be even less in the future.
Yeah, I mean, here, same thing, simple answer. Yes, it was in the past. Now it isn't to any great degree. And it's interesting, actually, how much Johnson's sort of conversion to the green agenda, or late conversion to the green agenda, means that then they're now all falling over themselves politically to prove how green they are. I think where there is a demarcation is on protest. So I think in the UK, what you find is, there was a great deal of criticism of the Labour Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, when he rushed to the defences of the Extinction Rebellion protests in the last couple of years, in terms of climate activism. I think for the majority of people, they are far more aware as voters of the green issue. The UK now has a green MP. Green is fundamentally the direction that politicians are travelling in order to supercharge the UK's economy in the future. So I think it's very much here to stay. And the old kind of dividing lines have gone, and now it's very much an older demographic, and fundamentally a much more right-wing demographic that still is entrenched in a sort of climate skepticism way in the UK.
Will, this is Paul. Didn't there used to be an overlap between the Brexiteers and climate skepticism? I debated a member of parliament who had both views about 5 years ago at Oxford, and but that seems to have broken with Johnson's victory, or has it?
Yeah, I think it has. I mean, I think there's always a distinction between those advocating for Brexit and those voting for Brexit. So what you'll find is there was a significant overlap, and fundamentally, Johnson now runs a more Brexit-facing right-wing party. What's interesting is that they are the exact voters who voted for Brexit in those northern communities, in places that felt completely disassociated from Brussels, let alone London, are exactly the places that Johnson now will have to prove that there is benefit in environmental policy to drive these new job creation schemes in the future. Otherwise, he's going to fail to level up, and these old industrial areas that need a green revolution are going to be left behind.
It's funny, Biden faces the same challenge in swing states in the United States. You described it very well.
Yeah, and the interesting point there, of course, from a swing state perspective is, leveling up is a 10, 15-year project. It doesn't happen overnight. But actually, discernibly, Johnson will have to prove his credentials in this space, and from a green environmental point of view, in terms of driving some of those jobs. Otherwise, the people in these swing constituency seats will vote the other way and return to voting Labour, which is what they always voted, and they'll put Johnson out of power in 2024.
Right. Yet another instance in which the short-term interests of a politician or a company, in some cases, conflict with the long-term goal here. And the question of how you try to align those short-term and long-term interests is kind of the key challenge, right, for dealing with this, both domestically and on an international scale and country after country. We've time for one last question, which is about the importance of farming and animal agriculture, meat eating, and whether that will ever be addressed, whether it's too political. I'll broaden that question out a little bit, which is basically, are there some areas that clearly would help to mitigate climate change? Another example in the US would be despite all the support for EVs that Biden has, there's no restriction actually on phasing out the internal combustion engine, unlike Britain, unlike many countries in Europe that have, and China, which have targets around the internal combustion phasing out. So when it comes to restricting and changing people's personal choices, in America in particular, do you find that was just politically impossible, Paul?
I think it's going to be driven by new technologies. So let's take dairy farming, for example. There are new technologies, digesters and others, that are vastly reducing the amount of methane that come from cattle. I think that there's a global problem with methane emissions from agriculture. They're about 30%. And this is a big problem that we're going to have to address. Agriculture turns out in the US to be a 10% emission, and forest 20% globally. It's actually a very important sector that deserves its own amount of time. I think in terms of US autos, Biden is going to regulate emissions, and it's going to be increasingly difficult for internal combustion engines to meet the standards. There is going to be a period over the next 10 years where all cars will be able to meet the standards, but increasingly the hope is that both with the carrot of investment incentives and the stick of regulation, the movement will be toward EVs, but consumers aren't there yet. I think this is probably the biggest question mark in the Biden agenda. Can we electrify US transport? I don't know. Cars are in the DNA of the American psyche. It's going to be a very difficult thing to do.
If you'll forgive me, I do actually think we have time for one last one. Jerry, you should intervene if I'm at risk of running over. But there's a question around whether people in Brazil care about the Amazon forest in the same way that Americans or Europeans do. So that strikes to a question which is basically about paternalism, whether there are countries in the West that are taking a paternalistic attitude towards resources elsewhere, and whether that conflicts with the interests of the people who actually live there.
Populism, like Trump and Bolsonaro have utilized it, can be incredibly powerful at the ballot box. There is a more sophisticated, and I view, productive type of populism that Boris Johnson has pioneered, and I would like Will's view on that, actually.
Johnson's populism is not Bolsonaro and Trump, or whatever the association. It's very different. It's based on, the only similarity is that in some ways the communication similarity, the kind of front speaking over the media directly to the audience. So I think the short answer to that question is, Johnson is a populist, but at the same time, is he being paternal towards the rainforest? Is he, I think it's more than that. He's got his own issues that he needs to solve from a green credentials point of view. So I think it's a little bit simplistic to suggest this is just leaning in elsewhere. I think from Boris Johnson's point of view, there is a real opportunity for change here, and he wants to grasp it.
Okay, that's all we have time for today. There's a huge amount, obviously, to cover, and I know that Edelman has other events planned, so that you'll be able to get into some of the issues raised today in further depth going forward. But I want to thank each of the panelists for participating, and thank you, Edelman, for having me.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Back over to Jerry.
Yeah, I want to thank everybody. It was really an enlightening conversation, and probably could have spent another hour on it. to that end, we will be doing some more of these events. And so stay tuned. We'll be sure to keep you all informed. We're going to try to take a little bit more of a global focus going forward as well to make sure other regions are represented. So watch this space, and thank you all for taking the time, and thank you panelists. Thank you, Charlotte. It was fantastic, and we'll see you in The Economist.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you, Will, Jerry.
Cheers all.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.